Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this session today. Today's session is going to be on Experience Edge at Scale, and it's going to be presented by Jeff Rondeau, who is um, working with Merkle as the manager for Sitecore Engineering, and is a multi-time Sitecore MVP and also a Coveo MVP, right, Jeff?
Yep.
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 All right. So thank you so much for taking the time, Jeff. Please take it forward.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. Very much appreciated. And thank you everyone here for taking some time out of your evening to come talk Experience Edge and Jamstack with me. But yeah, we're going to be talking about Experience Edge at scale and implementing the Sitecore Composable stack. So, yeah, you've all heard this before, right? But yeah, it's great to meet everyone. My name is Jeff Rondeau. I am now the manager of engineering of the Sitecore practice here at Merkle in the Americas. I'm a four-time Sitecore MVP, Coveo MVP, um, and also an avid lover of whiskey and a lover of dogs. So if anyone is going to be at Sitecore Symposium, making the long journey over there, next week, then if you see me in person, those are two things that are easy to start a conversation with me, whiskey or dogs. But yeah, it's really great to be here and looking forward to talking with you all. But enough about me. What are you going to get out of the next few minutes here? So first thing we're going to talk about is just what is Jamstack, right? Most of us are traditionally backend developers, right, as Sitecore developers. So we may not be familiar with the term Jamstack and what it is. So we'll talk a little bit about that, some of the common traits and attributes of a Jamstack architecture. Then we'll talk about Experience Edge and how it, along with Sitecore JSS, fits into that composable Jamstack architecture and picture. And then, kind of the meat and guts of this really are going to be, we implemented Experience Edge. We were one of the first folks to do so in the world. So we're going to talk about how it went, what went well, what didn't go so well, and give you some ideas, right, of when it comes time for you to maybe implement Experience Edge in the future, what you should do, and to hopefully arm you with success. And then finally, solution performance. So how did the story end, right? We implemented this, we made all these changes, but how did the solution actually perform in the wild? So we'll go over all of that. Okay, so what is Jamstack? So as I was putting this together and I was doing a little bit of research, I actually realized that Jamstack's been around a lot longer, at least than I thought it had. So if you rewind all the way back to 2015, 2016, which seems like an eternity ago, you've got static site generators or SSG like Jekyll that are starting to become popular, and the term Jamstack really comes to life in 2016. Then look into 2017, we start experiencing what we call the modern web revolution. So we're starting to prioritize things like performance, scalability, developer experience. And Jamstack continues to really gain wider adoption because it appeals to those three things and a lot more. 2018, we've got some tools that are pretty common even today that I'm sure most of you have heard of, like Netlify, Gatsby, Contentful, which are enabling rapid community growth. And we also have the very first Jamstack conference. So only, 4 years ago now. 2019 continues to go really mainstream. A lot of new tools, a lot of new services. 2020, this one I always think is just interesting. Jamstack with a capital J, A, and M actually shifts to go lowercase, to just JAM all lowercase. And Vercel is introduced along with Next.js, some very popular tools today. And from 2020 really onward, even through today, and I'm sure into 2023 next year as well, these concepts of the Jamstack architecture, the tooling, the community, it's very much on the rise. We've even seen, Sitecore, of course, with, Sitecore JSS and Sitecore Experience Edge. But you've also seen, your contentfuls. You've even seen your big players like Adobe, for example, get on the headless train, so to speak. Okay, so that's great, but what is Jamstack? So it stands for JavaScript APIs and Markup. So you've got your JavaScript, right, which is enabling all the dynamic aspects of your website. One of the benefits of Jamstack is that your front end and your back end are really decoupled or very loosely coupled. So your front end can work and use a separate set of tools than your backend. So you have no restriction on tooling or libraries or frameworks. You've got APIs. So those are your third-party or custom server-side functionalities that are called by your JavaScript, right, over HTTPS. So if you need to go get data from a CRM and render it out on a profile page, for example, your JavaScript would call that maybe at build time or maybe at runtime, and it would render it out over HTTPS. And then finally, markup. So if we're talking about websites, we need HTML of some sort. So your websites are often rendered as static HTML files. And we'll talk a little bit more about static site generators a little bit later, and why those give you so much speed. But those are the three core areas of Jamstack and what makes this architectural approach so great. So regardless of what technologies you use and how, if you're building, a store kiosk or a website, you're going to see a lot of common attributes and benefits to the Jamstack architecture approach. So the first one that I touched on just a moment ago, it's decoupled. So your front end and back end teams, they can use separate technologies and separate tooling. So your front end is often built using static site generators, and your backend gets integrated, right, by APIs during the build process, or sometimes even during the client side, on the client side at runtime. Static first. So often your sites are pre-rendered statically with your dynamic elements being powered by client-side JavaScript. So a lot of folks take the approach of, I'm going to statically render as many pages as I possibly can on my website, for example. And the things that I can't render statically because maybe they're dynamic or for some other, maybe project or technical reason, I'll render those at runtime, right, with client-side JavaScript. They're also progressively enhanced, where your JavaScript can be introduced as needed to increase performance on the browser. But performance is one of the things that is often synonymous with Jamstack. A lot of people hear Jamstack and they immediately think, oh man, it must be really fast, or they're doing this for performance. And Jamstack does lend itself naturally to incredible performance. Reason being, if you're doing all of that work of statically generating your site, making those API calls maybe, or running through a request pipeline, whatever it is, if you're doing those at build time, then your end user, right, your customer, when they request your page, they don't have to be the one to pay that price, so to speak, because you've already done that work up front. So you can get into a situation where you've already statically generated your entire site, and all you're doing is serving pre-built static HTML pages from a CDN, which is incredibly fast, right? And part of the performance, right, and why it's focused on so heavily is because of the expectations that we have as customers now. At least for me, for me personally. So, for example, the cost of just 1 second. So, for example, at Amazon, let's say their search experience on their app or maybe on their website just takes 1 second more. That costs them $1.6 billion in lost sales a year just from 1 second. Or if you're Google, it's 20 million lost searches a year. That's the cost of just 1 second. Now, I realize not all of us here, or potentially any of us here, right, work at Amazon or Microsoft, but for our customers and for us, right, the cost of 1 second can be huge, and we need to make our sites and experiences as fast as possible. Some other benefits, right? So more secure. So your attack surface area is greatly reduced. Again, if you're serving static HTML content over some sort of CDN, it's a lot harder for attackers to exploit your site. It's often less expensive from an infrastructure perspective. So you could get into a situation where uh, there are free infrastructure services to just serve HTML pages, and you could serve your entire site that way. It's a little bit, since most of us here are, Sitecore developers, it's not going to be free most of the time, but it can be less expensive than a lot of other options out there if you're going the Jamstack route. Your developer experience really goes up, so your front end, because it's decoupled, can focus on the front end, right, with their own tools and their own sets of their own ways of doing things, without being tied to a monolithic, maybe XP or XM architecture. And then finally, scalability. So if you're serving all this stuff from a CDN, it can just adjust to spikes in traffic, and you don't really have to do anything sometimes. So you don't have to worry about scaling up, scaling down, scaling out, or what geographies that you're serving content in, right? If you're serving in a site internationally. And that's all great, right? So I want to bring everyone back to reality. For a lot of us, what we've been doing for the last several years, most of us, right, we weren't doing that stuff. So as Sitecore developers, what were we doing, the past 5, 6, 7 years? It's been MVC and Razor. It's been content delivery servers. It's been content management servers. We've got Solar in the mix. Depending on your implementation, you might have XDB and all of the what I'll call fun, right? That goes along with that. Troubleshooting some of those 18 million services, it feels like at times, that makes XDB run. SQL marketing automation, if you're running that, could be running Cortex. You might have to set up your own CDN. Easy to say that it's a lot. It's a lot that we were dealing with, and we weren't in the Jamstack world. We saw maybe some of our front end friends or colleagues maybe that worked on those types of projects, or at least I did, while I was stuck in the land of complicated XP in a traditional Sitecore implementation. And I don't know about you, but at times it made me feel like this, where I was watching everyone else have fun, and I was Squidward in this picture, and everyone else was, SpongeBob and Patrick just having a great time. But of course, we know that's not the case permanently for us as Sitecore developers. Sitecore has introduced what they call headless services, formerly called JSS or JavaScript services. I'll probably always call it JavaScript services deep down in my heart. That's what I know it as. But Sitecore introduced headless, which was huge. So no more MVC, and that was a fundamental, almost monumental shift for a lot of us as Sitecore developers. So no more MVC, no more Razor, none of that anymore. You've got now a set of REST or GraphQL endpoints out there, and Sitecore really starts to function as an API server, where it's serving out content and it's serving out layout data for the front end to consume and to render. And on the front end, you can arm yourself with a couple of different SDKs. You've got .NET Core, which is much more of a closer experience to what you're used to working with in the traditional Sitecore MVC world in terms of like Razor, right? It's very close to that experience. Or some of their JavaScript rendering SDKs for technologies like Next.js. But at least in my opinion, your infrastructure can still be a little complex in the new world of headless Sitecore. I'll also be the first to admit it, infrastructure is not my specialty, so you might see this and might say, well, Jeff, that's super easy, and I don't know how you don't get it. And that's fair. But a sample request structure for just straight up old JSS. So you've got your visitor, they're making a request to your app, which really behind the scenes hits a node load balancer, and behind the scenes that's making a call to your different Node.js server-side rendering or SSR proxies, which proxy the request to your CD load balancer, which then ends up hitting some amount of your Sitecore CD servers. All of that comes back and it serves your app HTML to your application, which serves it back to your user. And this is all, keep in mind, just to render an HTML page, right? So it could be a really simple thing that we're trying to do, but there are a lot of steps involved. There are a lot of things that could go wrong, a lot of infrastructure here, and a lot of, at least in my opinion, complexity. But it's all well and good. We're still in the headless world, and this is at least how I felt, right, when I started doing headless development and working with and planning out solutions with the front end team. It's, they can do their thing, we can do ours, we kind of meet in the middle, and we felt like we were just best friends. And this is a great movie if anyone has seen it before, Step Brothers. Okay, so we know that Sitecore's got headless services. We know about Jamstack, but let's talk about this thing called Experience Edge. So we, as Sitecore developers, we're in the Jamstack world. We're using JSS. Everything's great. But I talked a little bit about that infrastructure complexity, right? And some of the needs that you're still going to have to scale, because you still could have Sitecore content delivery servers in the mix, which means you need to worry about scaling up, scaling out. What do those CD servers look like? But Sitecore comes around pretty recently now and announces this new SaaS offering called Experience Edge. So what is it? So it's a SaaS offering giving you globally replicated, scalable access to your items, your layout, and your media. The way I like to think of it is that it's essentially a CDN for your Sitecore content and for your media. And the media aspect of that, I don't think should be underplayed. I'll come back as to why in just a moment. But the reason it's able to do that is because it's a cached snapshot of your layout service along with your media library assets. So it's Sitecore hosted, right? Because it's SaaS. And it's really just a GraphQL API at the end of the day. That's really all that it is. But what that enables you to do is to power any device anywhere at any time. So whether you're building a website, maybe a native mobile app, an in-store kiosk, or something totally different. At the SUGCon presentation where I was fortunate enough to give this talk, one of the folks from Sitecore, Alistair, was giving a presentation on Experience Edge. And at the very end, he kind of showed that he was powering his whole presentation, not by PowerPoint or Google Slides or something like that, but actually with Experience Edge, just to show that you can power whatever you want with it. Your content's there as long as you can make, you're building an application that can understand GraphQL calls, then you're good to go. But what I'll show here in a moment is that this really reduces your infrastructure complexity. So the previous slide where it had the the people and the SSR proxies and the CD servers, that can all go away because it's all just Experience Edge now. It's your SaaS offering, and all of this enables your engineering team to focus their efforts elsewhere. So whether it's picking the right icon, because as we all know, picking icons is 99% of our job as Sitecore developers, or if it's in all seriousness, focusing on some of the things that can often be overlooked in an implementation, like your content management, your content authoring experience, right? It enables whatever it is. It enables you to focus your efforts elsewhere instead of having to worry about getting a call maybe at like midnight or 2 in the morning about, hey, the load on the CD server is really high. Can you come fix it? How do we need to scale? Don't have to worry about those things anymore. So want to go back really briefly to the CDN for content and media. So a lot of times in our implementations, it's a best practice to have your media assets served from a CDN and to take that load off of your CD servers, which is great, but it's one more step, right? It's one other thing that we may have to do or your team has to do, but not anymore. You kind of get a two birds for one stone situation with Experience Edge because you get your content served really fast, but now you also have your media served really fast, which is really cool. So you've got so much more room for activities. And I promise, I think this is the last Step Brothers meme and GIF in the presentation. So the architecture of Experience Edge, what does it actually look like? So at the bottom, we've got the content management role, so the CM that we all know and love. Nothing different about that. And then we have the Experience Edge connector, which is a module that really just gets installed onto your CM server. And that's what takes care of and enables the communication between your CM and Experience Edge. So it hooks into the publishing process, and it makes sure that you're able to send your items and that layout snapshot in your media to Experience Edge, so Experience Edge can serve that wherever your application needs it, right? Maybe it's the browser, maybe you're running something in Next.js and you're consuming it at build time or runtime, whatever it is, your content's there and your content's ready. And it's all over GraphQL. That's an important piece to remember too, is your requests to Experience Edge, they're all using GraphQL queries. Okay, so we talked about Experience Edge, we talked about Sitecore JSS, and we talked a little bit about Jamstack. So I want to shift a little bit now and talk about a real life example and what we encountered and how we ended up using both of those technologies in an actual Sitecore implementation. So first I want to give you just kind of set a little bit of background about the project that we were walking into. So our client was a existing Sitecore MVC customer, and they also had Xamarin in the mix. If you're not familiar with that technology, it's a technology that's used to make mobile apps. But they were a restaurant holding company, so they owned a bunch of different distinct restaurant chains, and all of them had some technologies in common, but they had some things that were just unique. Like this brand decided to implement this technology and this brand over here didn't. So they had disparate technology stacks across their organization. So what they needed at the end of the day was for their 7 brands, they needed 7 websites and 7 mobile apps, one for each. So a total of 14 websites and 14 mobile apps with shared content, and hundreds of millions of dollars wanting to go through this digital platform. So this unified system that we were building, it was going to be a significant part of their business. They were going to push literally millions of dollars through this platform. So it was really important that it perform and really important that it scale. All right, so at a really high level, what did our architecture look like? So at the top, everything's hosted, in GitHub, but you can pick, source control provider of your choosing. On the bottom, if we take a look at Sitecore, at the beginning, we had our CM server, we had our CD servers, and those were serving out our content, our media, over GraphQL. And we chose to use Next.js and host our front end, because we still need somewhere to host the front end of our site. We hosted the front end on Vercel. So during build time and during at times runtime, we would get that content from Sitecore, and we would also power our native mobile apps that were using React Native using GraphQL. So focusing kind of on the right side of that picture, we have an API or a middleware So we talked about Jamstack, so JavaScript API and markup. So the API portion of that was hosted in Azure using Kubernetes, and that took care of proxying kind of and abstracting those calls to our third parties, which in our case were Punch and Olo and Cheetah, but quite honestly, what the third parties were really doesn't make a difference for this. But at a really high level, that's our architecture. So we're moving along. We're mid-development. We haven't launched anything yet, right? And we get the announcement, like everyone here, that there's this new product called Sitecore Experience Edge, and it's really quick, and here are all the benefits. And our client, of course, sees that as well. And then we have a decision to make. Are we going to keep using our Sitecore content delivery servers, our existing architecture, or are we going to adopt Sitecore Experience Edge? Well, what do we do? Well, spoiler alert, we adopted it, but not before a lot of really lengthy conversations with both Sitecore and with our client. So with any new software offering, whether it's from Sitecore or whether it's from anyone else, the first version of that, the first iteration, likely is going to have a bit more kind of kinks and quirks and some bugs maybe than you're going to have in the 17th or 100th version of that product. And we knew that going in. So what we did was we wanted to have kind of a backup plan, like a ripcord that we could use in case something went wrong with Experience Edge and we could pivot and our development teams aren't going to be blocked. So we ended up keeping our content delivery servers. So we kept them. Sure, we weren't using them, but they were there in case we needed them. And we, in order to do that, we on the front end implemented the ability to quickly toggle whether we're using Experience Edge and we're getting content from there, or if we're just getting content from our CD servers. So we did that with an environment variable, but because we were using GraphQL, there really wasn't a whole lot of application code that really needed to change. So now that we adopted Experience Edge, what did our architecture look like? How did it change? Looks pretty much the same, right? The only differences are with the Sitecore box at the bottom. So you see our CD servers there in the bottom right corner that are kind of grayed out because we're not using them, but they're there if we need them, but they're just hanging out. But now we have Experience Edge. So it's that Experience Edge architecture that we talked about previously, where all the authoring happens on our CM server, just like always. We publish content out to Experience Edge, and then the applications are really none the wiser because they're already using GraphQL. So the response is no different. So from the front end side of things, it's abstracted away from them. They don't know, they don't care. We could swap things back and forth kind of as we choose, and we're able to run with this and make it go. But Experience Edge does have limitations, and we know this. Sitecore knows this, and these are actually really, to their credit, these are really well documented on Sitecore's site. So a couple key callouts. So it only supports Solr as your search provider. It does not support Sitecore personalization rules or content testing, or really any sort of dynamic or contextual output from your layout service. Reason from that being that remember, it's a snapshot of your layout service. That's how we're able to serve it so quickly, because it's a cached snapshot. So you can't make a snapshot dynamic in different ways. Couple at the bottom here. So publishing a single item could result in publishing hundreds. That's because in Experience Edge, it has to flatten kind of some of those hierarchies and relationships to make it, I guess, fit their schema and how they need to serve it. So we all know this, right? We've probably had a content author or maybe someone who's just getting into Sitecore that says, well, I hit publish related items and I've been waiting here for 4 days waiting for the publish to finish. So we're probably used to a little bit of, hey, I published one thing and it's publishing a bunch. Also doesn't enforce security constraints, so that's a big one. So make sure that you're using workflow to control what items go out there, what items do not, or just publishing restrictions in general. And then finally, it only supports the default device, which most times, at least in what I've seen, isn't a big deal. A lot of people don't use that often. So what are some of the implementation lessons that we learned? First thing, Experience Edge caching can be problematic. So if I go into the CM and I need to change maybe just the heading on a page, so I go in, I make my heading change, I hit publish, I get the familiar modal that pops up at the end that says, you changed this many items, skipped this many, deleted this many, whatever. I expect at that point that I can go out, I can see my updated content. But in reality, that didn't always happen. I would publish it and I would wait, I'd refresh and refresh and refresh, but the content never changed. And the builds, right, because we're kicking off builds of our front end website are happening. The builds are succeeding, no problem, but the content and Experience Edge wasn't updating. And that was a problem because that's ultimately, think of it like your web database wasn't getting up to date. It's really the same problem. So we've been working with Sitecore on this, and they gave us a couple workarounds, and they're addressing some of the problems with that. But I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a problem during development. Second, have a contingency plan ready. So for us, that meant keeping our CD servers and being able to switch back and forth. For you, it might mean something totally different. But depending on when you adopt this, if you adopt Experience Edge, like 3 years from now, probably not as big of a deal to have a contingency plan because it's not a brand new product. But at the very beginning, I would just make sure that you've got something in some way, some sort of plan, right, in case something goes wrong during your development. Incorporate appropriate monitoring. So if Experience Edge has some sort of error, or if you're trying to publish something out and something fails, you should be aware of that. So make sure that you've got a robust monitoring infrastructure and plan in place there. Adopt GraphQL early. This one's really big. So whether you're planning to use Experience Edge now, in the future, or maybe never at all, I would start using GraphQL now as much as you can. In just traditional Sitecore JSS, you don't have to use GraphQL. You can just make REST calls. But I would start using GraphQL now, because what that enables you to do is if you want to switch to Experience Edge, you can, because you're already using GraphQL. But if you're not, then you've got a lot of application code to write, and you have a lot more work to switch, and you're introducing more risk, which is something that you need to assess, right? Anytime you're bringing on a brand new tool, again, whether it's from Sitecore or from someone else, you need to assess your appetite for risk. Both you and if you're, a consulting organization, then your client or your stakeholders. But I do firmly believe that Edge is the future. This is the way Sitecore is going. You've seen all of their announcements around XM Cloud and these different SaaS offerings, and Sitecore Experience Edge is a part of that. And this is all really powerful when it comes together. When this stuff works and it really does come together with your front end, your back end, your APIs, it's really, really cool. And it's really fast too, which we'll talk about here in a moment. So often, right, with Jamstack architectures, talk about speed. Talk about that a little bit at the beginning. So for us, how did the story end? How did all of this perform? So screenshots here, just Lighthouse scores. On the left is the before, on the right is the after. Hope that's self-explanatory, otherwise this talk would be a real big flop if we went from a 98 to a 59. But on the left, this is just the menu. So again, we're building a website for restaurants. So if I'm going to order food online, I need to browse a menu, and it needs to be quick. So I'm sure we've all seen Lighthouse scores from sites that maybe we're redesigning or going to be working on that are way worse than a 59. 59 it isn't that bad, but we're able to take them all the way to a 98 with our new technologies. So first contentful print down to 0.6 seconds, speed index 1.2, time interactive 1.8, really, really blazing quick. Then our homepage, going from a 52 all the way up to a 99 on performance. So first contentful print from 3 seconds down to a third of a second. Time to interactive from 6.6 down to 1.0 seconds. And again, it's worth mentioning their existing site. So all the stuff on the befores, that's with traditional MVC and Sitecore. So it's Sitecore to Sitecore. It's just different tooling, different architectures, and a different stack at the end of the day. And then finally, a product detail page, really important. If I'm browsing food, click on a sandwich pops up. Again, needs to be quick. Otherwise, people, they move on. They don't buy. They don't send you money. So a 91 there. And then finally, with for sell, because we're consuming this content at build time, we noticed an 11% decrease in our build times, which, depending on what platform you use, lower build times, lower time spent during build, we'll go with that, can result in money back in your pocket because you're not paying for that time. So that's huge. So at the end of all this, you might be thinking, is Experience Edge right for me? And I'll give the classic engineering answer of it depends. It depends on a bunch of different things: your team's skill set, your appetite for risk, how ready you are to start using some of these technologies like GraphQL, like just JSS in general. Are your teams prepared? Do they have the right training? All of these questions are things that you have to ask yourself. But again, it is really powerful when things do come together, and headless and SaaS and Experience Edge, that is the way that Sitecore is moving. They've made that very, very clear. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about it at Symposium next week with things like XM Cloud and their other cloud-based offerings. And with that, here are a couple resources. I'll send out these slides. So if you follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, then you'll see this go out. But these are just a couple good resources to get you started. So the top two are about Jamstack, if you're interested in learning a little bit more. The middle one is about some of the limitations of Experience Edge. Again, these are really well documented on Sitecore's site. And then the one at the bottom, I realize it says the Experience Edge connector, but it's got a really great graphic about the publishing process when you use Experience Edge, because it's a lot different and a lot more steps involved than what we're used to if we're just pushing content from master to web. So it's a good diagram. It's a nice little bit of info for you there. But finally, I'm easy to get a hold of, or at least I like to think I am. Here are my social handles. And yeah, thank you very much for having me. And I'll open it